Hi, I'm Steve Heuser. I'm the Global Technology Editor for Politico. It's true, I'm Brendan's boss, and I'll return the favor by recommending that you read Brendan's article that just published yesterday. This is the part of the day when I tell you to read Politico, because we're very, very proud of our developing global technology coverage in our Brussels and our Washington and our flourishing new UK office. And Brendan wrote a really interesting article about a guy named Joe White, who is the UK's consul in San Francisco, but what he really is he's kind of an ambassador to the American tech industry. And he is in the US and Washington trying to sort of court the tech industry and develop their interest in working closely with the UK. There's a rival European tech ambassador, Gerard de Graaf, who a lot of people here may know, and he's doing something very similar. And in this push and pull between regulation and opportunity between the UK and the EU, we're really lucky today to have this really interesting panel on the topic that everyone seems to weave into their topic, which is artificial intelligence. So we're delighted to have, I'll introduce them to you right now. I'll do a little bit of housekeeping and then we'll get it going. Lucilla Scioli is on the far left. She is the Director for Artificial Intelligence and for Digital Industry at DG Connect at the European Commission. For those of you who understand the Byzantine workings of European lawmaking, they get the ball rolling and then they enforce the law at the end, and then in the middle there's a trilogue which is about to start happening today, and that's actually, we're at a really, really interesting point in the process, and we're really delighted that she can be here. Dragos Tudorache, who is the parliamentarian and the rapporteur on the parliament side, unfortunately got caught in a lengthy plenary session, won't be able to join us today. But we also will have, we have on my panel Viscount Camrose, who promises we can call him Jonathan, so we're all on a first name basis here. As an American, I would have to protest if it was otherwise. And he is the Parliamentary Undersecretary of State and the Minister for AI and Intellectual Property in the UK, which is a relatively new job, which we're pretty interested in hearing a little bit more about. And Stephen Almond, who is the Executive Director of Regulatory Risk at the Information Commissioner's Office, and essentially he's the privacy regulator for Britain under the Britain's own GDPR rules. And so what that means is he's sort of the enforcer. And obviously we were just talking, Britain itself has a long history of data regulation that now is being enforced through this mechanism. It's really an important part of the conversation around AI. So the housekeeping part is, thank you so much for being here in person. Thank you for staying toward the end of the day. I'm thrilled to have this panel, and make sure you stay around for our very last segment, which is going to be a one-on-one interview between Matt Kaminsky, the editor of Politico in the US, and Catherine Tai. Ambassador Catherine Tai is the US Trade Representative. So that will be a lot of fun. We're very excited to see you, and we're very excited to have our online audience watching as well. Okay. So we're here today because the thing I described is happening, right? The EU is in this moment when they're about to work through the final negotiating process of what is intended to be probably the pioneering law governing artificial intelligence in the world. The UK at the same time is actually moving very, very, very quickly to establish itself in a sort of a different kind of leadership position. And for America, we're watching these tensions between these two things happen while nothing happens in America, and except the technology is developing at a wild runaway pace that's sort of freaking everybody out. I wanted to start actually with a question for the home team. And my question is actually for you, Jonathan. And you get this is the penalty you pay for being the last person to arrive. The AI minister is a relatively new job. And we're very curious to ask the most American question possible. What do you do? And if I could, I'll refine it just a bit, which is if I'm say a tech company, or if I'm a British citizen of the UK, or if I am, say, a regulator, coming from another country wanting to engage in some kind of dialogue, what would I go to the AI minister for? What's your role in the evolving conversation here?
Yeah, well, thank you, and first let me thank you very warmly for the chance to be here. Not least because in more ways than one, this is the coolest place in Whitehall at the moment. So yes, I have this very unusual role that cuts across a range of areas of technology. I think most interestingly to most people, AI, but also intellectual property, which is a quite interesting, in a way, constraint on AI. I also touch on cybersecurity, geospatial, and a range of other things. I'm curious as a minister or vaguely curious as a minister in that I'm a member of the House of Lords rather than the House of Commons, and that carries with it a lot of other sort of legislative requirements. Perhaps let me talk briefly about goals for AI, if that kind of goes to the question. And I think it's, the way I see it, whenever a bunch of people get together these days and talk about AI, they start inevitably talking about the risks and the downside, and that is important. But I always like to position it as, you know what, we have an unbelievable kind of opportunity here to increase our shared productivity, tenfold or some arbitrary number fold. And the reason we want to regulate AI, and we all do share this goal of wanting to regulate AI, is just so that we can see these unbelievable benefits that I think we all stand to achieve. So I see regulation of AI as the pathway to the possible.
And what does the minister do?
What
Well, as the minister, yeah. So how's your role? What is your role in the operation? A lot of this is being run out of Downing Street. Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister Sunak, is he's with Joe Biden talking about AI and very high-profile delegations. And
so as a minister, my actual priority, principal role is to take legislation through Parliament. Through a range of different topics, and we've got the online safety bill going through Parliament at the moment, something being extremely closely scrutinised. There'll be other bills coming up. We have the data protection bill coming through, and so on. Otherwise, I tend to liaise in a marginally less public way with some of the visitors that come to our shores. So I have the great good fortune to meet with them, to meet with some of the brilliant AI and other tech companies operating in the UK around our sector, and to kind of help shape the strategy and our collective national delivery of the AI strategy.
Lucille, I'd like to sort of move to you. Jonathan was describing sort of Britain's vision for this and what a regulation would even mean if it ever were to happen. But the EU right now is in a position where they're moving forward in a pioneering way. There's a new technology that's moving faster than anybody, I think, would have expected, even when the legislation was being developed. How does Europe, if I pull all the way back, how does Europe see itself? What path is it trying to set for the world? What example is it trying to set at the roots of the law and also the implementation? How do you see yourself as guiding the overall conversation here?
Well, first of all, I think that the bill that we are preparing in the European Union is the first in the world to have that comprehensive approach. Right. I mean, there are smaller bills in some states of the United States, also probably in other countries, but the European one is the first comprehensive legislation looking not so much at AI as a technology, but to the use of the technology in certain context. And it is risk-based, and I think this has really opened the reflection for everybody, and I don't know the details of the British approach, but I would imagine it's risk-based as well. I know when we discussed with the United States in the context of the Trade and Technology Council, they are also favorable to a risk-based approach, meaning you only regulate the use of artificial intelligence when this can be very risky for the violation of fundamental rights and safety. This is the approach that we carry out. So we don't have the objective of regulating artificial intelligence in all its applications, because this is a new technology, and you have to make sure that innovation happens for all the reasons that were said earlier, because artificial intelligence is good for our economies and our societies. We only have to be able to make sure that the guardrails are respected and that we as citizens are respected in our fundamental rights.
Right. Now, I know you can't, we're always interested as journalists in what's next, right? And I know you can't predict what's going to happen in the negotiations right now, and you don't represent Parliament, but there is an AI pact also being discussed, and that is something that presumably would fill the gap in time between now and the implementation of a law that's hasn't even been finally negotiated yet. Can you talk a little bit about the AI pact? Because that's something that I've watched I've seen it be described and discussed, and I sort of wonder what it is, as it is not the law.
Well, you see, the Artificial Intelligence Act is in trilogue. Our ambition is to finalize these discussions at the end of the year. After that, some provisions will enter in force after 2 years. So we have a transitional period of 2 years, because during these 2 years, we need to develop standards, develop governance in the member states. So we have to do a number of things for which we were not ready to to implement the act immediately. But of course, we say to ourselves now, well, what are we going to do for those 2 years? We're just going to wait. So the idea came of an AI pact, which basically means that companies that are interested on a voluntary basis, they could already start implementing the Artificial Intelligence Act or part of the Artificial Intelligence Act on a voluntary basis, maybe on a best effort basis, so that we can already make sure that we have trustworthy behaviors, at least in the European Union. Because let's not forget, the Artificial Intelligence Act is based on the market of the European Union. So it's about, it has to be respected by companies that put high-risk AI in service in the European Union.
What companies do you expect to sign on?
We will see, because we have not started yet to discuss with companies, but I would expect all the companies that are active on the European Union market from the point of view of artificial intelligence, of high-risk applications of artificial intelligence, may decide to sign up. I think it's a very good thing for also for their reputation and certainly for the European citizens.
So, but you haven't been in negotiations with individual companies yet, because there's
not yet. No.
Okay. Forgive me, Lucilla has to catch a train, and we'll have to leave in, I don't know, 5 minutes or something. We want to be responsible for her schedule, and so we'll over-index a little bit on Lucilla at the beginning of this. But the one thing I actually was curious to talk about a little bit is there's an argument, and Stephen, actually, this is something I'd like to talk to you about, but fortunately, you don't have a train. We can do that later. There's an argument that the existing regulations that we have in terms of like privacy and data protections and so forth are adequate to the problems, right? That AI is a tool, and that like if we enforce them adequately and you staff things right, you can actually deal with a lot of the problems that AI presents. Now, in Europe's view is obviously we actually do need a new law around this, and I'm curious where that view came from. Like philosophically, like why does this thing require its own law instead of being able to something you can manage through the existing frameworks you have, which are pretty strong?
Well, the data protection regulation is about the protection of privacy, but the challenges and the risk that artificial intelligence brings go beyond privacy. Yeah. Privacy is one of them. Yep. If you don't have a privacy regulation, artificial intelligence can be a problem. But also beyond privacy, there are issues of bias, discrimination. There are issues now with the generative AI kind of applications of disinformation. There are issues, there are many different issues that can be brought that go well beyond privacy.
Okay, you're very close on time. I don't want to, but yeah. No, it's fine. I want to make sure this works. I was very late to a train myself, and I'm very sympathetic. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for being here. Stephen, I'll turn to you right now. This is really the question I wanted to ask you as well, which is, in the UK, are the existing mechanisms that we have adequate to the problem? Or, I realize you can't speculate on this, but is there a view that at some point AI itself will need to be tackled? You sit there from the perspective of an existing regulator, and I'm guessing that you think you could handle a lot of these problems.
Indeed. So AI is built on data. Yep. And actually many of the use cases that we see that have probably the greatest salience in terms of kind of public policy concerns are around AI that is built on personal data. And actually, it's a shame that Michele is gone, because one of the things I was going to say was that data protection is actually about so much more than just purely privacy in a very narrow sense, but actually covers those important concepts of fairness, transparency, etc., that are going to be critical here in terms of being able to tackle bias, discrimination, and so on and so forth. Which is not to say, by any stretch of the imagination, that data protection is the only answer to some of the challenges that we face. And actually, there are a whole suite of different things that are going to require responses from a whole range of regulators. So we've talked, for example, a little bit and touched on the importance of questions around intellectual property, for example. And so there's going to be a clear role for the Intellectual Property Office, for example, in the UK to play here. So what is, I think, really heartening to see in the UK perspective is an emphasis on actually how do we make sure that where we have existing rules and regulations in place, that we are actually operating those consistently across regulatory boundaries, so firms aren't going from one regulator to another and finding it complex to join things up. And actually, having a sort of a consistent approach and thinking, to some of those fundamental principles that I think we can probably all agree are really important in terms of the governance of AI.
You're walking us into the white paper here, aren't you? So I have one other question on the, are you staffed adequately for this? I mean, AI is one of the fastest moving technologies we've ever seen, maybe the fastest. It's owned by the largest technology companies in the world. They are not notably interested necessarily in thinking through all these things before we start moving fast. Do you have the resources that you need? Are you hiring, for example, AI experts right now to sort of like staff ICO for its full responsibilities in this new world?
Oh, we sure are. Yeah. And thank you for the advertorial. If you want to come and work for the ICO on AI, we're hiring. But actually, and just to your point here around sort of, I suppose, readiness to kind of confront some of the risks here. I'm quoted earlier today as talking about concerns from our end about firms, in the race to realize lots of the commercial opportunity here, and my goodness, there's a lot of real opportunity from AI, potentially turning a blind eye to some of the risks. And from my perspective, obviously, I'm concerned about firms potentially taking a blind eye to the privacy risks. And that's why we've got regulation right now. We've got a regulator right now that is really thinking about, okay, are firms really thinking these risks through before they bring product to market?
In the generative AI world, which is the thing we're thinking about a lot right now, what are those risks? What do you see when you look at the generative AI models that are coming out now? When you talk about privacy from your perspective, what are those risks? What are you concerned about?
So there's a plethora of sort of data-driven risks that we see here from, for example, the risks around. Again, we've touched on questions around bias and discrimination, the inputs that you put in, what are you getting out, and how that plays through. I think for models that are trained on very large volumes of data, for example, there are questions around security. For example, what data, if you're canny in terms of asking the right queries, can you get out some of the data that went into developing the model, and what does that mean for the security of people's personal information?
Prompt injection. So, are you confident? I was at Google DeepMind yesterday, and one thing that emerged was that although Sam Altman likes to wave his hands around and say this thing we're building is a black box, we don't understand it well enough to disclose what's in it, they seemed confident that it was relatively legible and that the thing that they understood it well enough to be able to sort of engage on the sort of regulatory level with like the contents of the box. Are you confident that that's true? Are you even in conversations with like these big the Microsoft and Google about like whether they will disclose this to you, whether are they able to sort of open the box and show you things that make you confident that they can regulate before you guys have to step in?
So as you would expect, we're in conversation with all the major players in this space about their approach to data protection compliance, and we have tools in the box in the legislation that we have in the UK that mean that actually we can ask questions and we can exact answers from firms, and that doesn't just go through to, for example, issuing requests for information, but actually goes right the way through to being able to potentially explore the potential to take forward audit type activities to make sure that things are being done right.
So are they showing you things that they're not disclosing to sort of the financial community and things like that because you're the regulator?
I won't comment on commercial positions and in terms of the firms right now, but it's very important that the firms can have a full and frank dialogue with us about what they're doing.
What is the list of firms with like generative AI models that you're concerned enough about to have this conversation? Like, let's say we know it's Microsoft and Google. We can just cross those off the list. But who else are you talking to about this?
It wouldn't be responsible for me as a regulator, I'm afraid,
But
to start to
it would be
very list of firms.
Very responsible to you as the guest at a media.
I kind of
voluntarily said yes to our invitation. Okay, well, but it's a very interesting question, right? Because these are companies that are renowned for their secrecy, and disclosing to almost anybody is almost anathema to some of the sort of corporate culture. And so this is one of the more interesting things to us to watch, is to what extent are they going to open up the processes, which in some ways are hard to understand to people who are paying attention to the regulations. To get to the white paper that we were sort of walking up to before, and this is going to move for Jonathan, and you're off the hot seat, Stephen. Britain issued a white paper. Well, I should start with like the Prime Minister stood in the White House recently and talked a lot about the UK's new role as sort of a global convener of the regulatory conversation around AI. There's an AI summit being planned. He used the word guardrails several times. And because I am both a journalist and kind of lazy, I went into the white paper instead of reading, and I used search, and I discovered that the word guardrails does not appear anywhere in the entire white paper, which is only like 3 months old, except in a footnote, literally footnote 86. It's the only time guardrails is used. What changed? Like, the guardrails is now literally one of the headline words in when the Prime Minister speaks about it. And I understand that the general enthusiasm and interest in the topic is consistent. But something has changed. Something has changed in the willingness to talk about regulations, to sort of assume this sort of like leadership and guardrails role. Yeah. I'm curious how you see this and what's going on.
It would be helpful to start, for me anyway, with just a very brief kind of statement. What are the principles behind the white paper? And I think, for me, the most important there are 3 really important principles behind the approach. One is, don't duplicate the work of existing regulators. And I think that's a recipe. Doing so would be a recipe for mess. And I think we've heard very clearly why we wouldn't do that. The second one is kind of be agile, be willing to change, be collaborative. And sort of have that humility and a bit sort of willingness to change. And the third one is, and I wish Lucilla was still here, because it would be really interesting to hear her views on this.
Yeah.
But don't necessarily go after existing technologies. Now, of those 3, the one that I think is most relevant to your question is agility and willingness to change. So that is built straight in, and it is possible that when the white paper was being written, maybe the tone of discussions around AI was a bit different, a little bit more optimistic than we hear today, but still it has this agility built in, and nothing about the white paper has changed. Maybe the tone with which we describe it has, and we tend to talk more about safety and guardrails and other associated language, to help people, understand that emphasis.
This is, I like that you've redefined it as agility. That's impressive. That was well. I understand. Actually, the ability of governments to change quickly enough to respond to the conversation is a pretty important part of this whole dynamic, right?
Yeah.
I had an interesting question from the audience. Should conversational AI, and whoever wants to field this, I'd love to hear the answers. Should conversational AI, like a human voice speaking to a machine, require any kind of special treatment for privacy? It is not telephony, is the end of the question. But I actually don't know the underlying regime where it comes to like privacy or anything with voice conversation. So would there be an additional layer of interest from you?
So it feels like I should probably sort of take the lead in terms of zooming in here. Look, conversational AI, but actually more broadly in terms of AI, where it's processing people's personal data, there are really clear expectations around transparency. There are, to use the term guardrails, there are guardrails around that in terms of people having good understanding of how their personal information is being collected, how that information is being processed. And that's definitely going to be true in contexts like conversational AI in terms of how that information is processed.
Okay. There's another question I'll ask as well. Should we expect to see and this makes some assumptions that you may want to defend against it. Should we expect to see the ICO step in soon on generative AI and its breaches of UK data protection law, where it has left it to the EU DPAs so far?
So in the UK, we are a separate data protection authority. We're not part of the EU's one-stop shop mechanism for managing data protection issues. And actually that enables us to take an approach which fits the needs of the issues that we see as they emerge in the UK. You can bet your bottom dollar that we are looking very, very closely at some of the emerging use cases. And my comments earlier today about firms potentially taking a blind eye, I think should give some comfort to those of you who are thinking, okay, is the regulator really awake around this one? Yeah. We certainly are.
So what happens if you decide the firms are taking a blind eye?
So what we are particularly keen to see at the minute is to see that firms where they're looking in sort of high-risk contexts, for example, that they have done their homework, that they have undertaken proper assessment of the risks that are inherent in the management of people's personal data, and that they are then actually taking forward strategies to mitigate the highest risks that they see. And where they don't, and we hope that they do, where they don't, we have the full range of regulatory tools at our disposal. But actually, I just want to also say, because we started this conversation talking about opportunity, and I do want to loop back to that. So where firms are looking at this and going, you know what, I'm not sure. This is new. This is a bit challenging. I want some clarity on how the law applies to my innovation. My goodness, is our door open. We have, in fact, we have an innovation advice service that will provide AI innovators with responses within 15 working days on their questions in terms of how the law applies. So it is definitely not just the dour message from the regulator here. We're here to support the innovators too.
Well, so to that point, actually, we're right back at the thing we were talking about at the very beginning, where Britain is making a fairly strong push to explain that you have a friendly reception waiting for you in the UK if you're interested in research and if you're interested in putting your headquarters here and some other things like that. So have you seen any specific successes where you have like a company or a institute or something that's was looking at going to Germany or Brussels or something and is now working with you guys and maybe coming over to the UK? Like in terms of a pure economic competition standpoint, is it working? Like who's knocking at your door that's maybe not knocking at the
well,
door now?
Yeah, look, we are regularly ranked third in the kind of AI competitive index after the US and China. We have a huge and growing AI sector here. I think it contributed 11 billion pounds to the economy last year. I'm told that of all of the users or the registered users of the publicly available generative AI tools, they are massively disproportionately British, the logins. So we have a kind of culture and history of really being up for this. And we do see companies moving here. I think Palantir last week, just from memory, is opening their AI headquarters here. And there's a range of these things. I mean, whether there are a bunch of other companies moving elsewhere in Europe, I cannot tell you. But it feels to me like we have a compelling offer.
Britain also leads you're going to hate that I bring it back to this, but I'd be completely remiss on behalf of my audience if I didn't bring it back to this. But Britain also leads in another AI there. I mean, but the research, I don't think people understand quite how deep and broad the research community here is. The excellent, I mean, who knows about China, but the excellent, I mean, the depth and importance of in fairness, of the industry here is pretty extraordinary. However, it also leads in another AI, which is like, Britain is where the extinction risk philosophers live and come from, and you are also driving the conversation about AI ending the world. And that leads us into the conversation about what on earth is this thing, right? We talk about it as though we all know what it is, and unfortunately we didn't really get to engage the Europeans on it because they weren't able to finish the panel, but and there may be some slightly contrasting views. But this is a thing we don't fully understand what it's even going to be yet, right? We're talking about it like it's a thing that you can legislate. It's moving so fast that we keep learning about the weird stuff it can do, and it feels disruptive in ways we don't understand. And this is the fun part, the reward for staying until almost 6 o'clock. But the range of things that might happen is extraordinary, right? There's a set of risks that you have to worry about. Even if you're very optimistic about its potential, there's a set of risks you have to worry about. And they range all the way from very near-term risks, like it is already discriminating against people inside that box and we don't know how, to it is going to be wildly disruptive to part of the labor force that hasn't been disrupted before, which is this part of the labor force, the white-collar part. All the way toward it's going to have goals out of alignment with human beings and accidentally snuff us out. When you think about those things, and when you think about the future of where Britain wants to be in AI regulation, what are the things you are actually worried about and trying to protect against, while cultivating the opportunity that you're looking to cultivate?
Welcome to my life. Yes, I think you've described it absolutely right. I mean, I think there's sort of two waves kind of coming at us. And the one wave is, as the points you raise, it's disruption to the workplace and the labor market, loss of agency for people at schools, and these are quite well rehearsed. And then there's the second wave, the so-called control problem, the risk of that we somehow create an artificial intelligence and then that no longer wishes for us to exist as a species. And
I'm glad you at least can talk about that.
Depending on who you talk to, that is either possible within 2 years or not possible at all, or possible in 50 years. So you kind of take your pick, and I'm not going to pick one. I think that the most recent, or the prediction I saw recently of 2 years was taken wildly out of context.
So I will say that DeepMind thinks AGI is going to happen much faster than I thought that they thought it.
Yes.
Yeah, their timeline is accelerating. I don't mean extinction. I don't mean out of alignment AGI, but an AGI.
I think
fast.
one thing we do see is that the researchers look at some of the large language models' output, and they are amazed by what it's capable of and its emergent capabilities.
Sure. So if you think of, when you think of what you can actually protect people in the UK from and what you are trying to do, in the next year or two, and I've realized there's not a law in the books, but there's, what would they be? Is discrimination the sort of like the first line you're trying to police? I understand, Stephen, that you have a responsibility to privacy in the existing data regulations, which makes sense. But what are the other things, that you're most immediately concerned about?
So, our approach has been quite deliberately not to name, okay, here are the 17 things we're afraid of.
In order.
In
right,
order.
Yeah.
But to say, okay, these are the positive principles we want to promote. I won't kind of list them all, but they're things like fairness, redress, governance, and so on. So that, as I always say, our goal is not to make people trust AI. Our goal is to make AI worthy of people's trust. And we have to make this technology safe. And I think the approach that we've set out is to say, okay, these are the principles we're going after. To deliver on those principles, we're going to, first of all, use our existing brilliant regulators. Second, we're going to have a kind of central risk function scanning the horizon for both kind of all different kinds of risks. And we're going to have a kind of regulatory sandbox that allows us to test some of these things out. Now, does that help us stave off Armageddon? I honestly don't know, but I think it is the most sensible and proportionate set of steps that we can take today.
since you mentioned Armageddon, is there a separate track of thinking about these things that addresses that problem, right? Because a lot of the things we're talking about now are like existing social ills, right, that AI could exacerbate or speed up, but they're things that we've thought about before and things that there's mechanisms to deal with. Extinction risk problem, and I don't want to dwell on this, it's not really our topic, but it's a totally different type of problem.
Yeah.
Is that a thing that folks are thinking about in the ministry, in Downing Street, right? I mean, it seems science fiction-y to a lot of people, but the most serious people in the industry also think about it all the time.
Yeah.
This is not a weirdo topic.
No, and as you would expect, very much so. I think the working assumption behind how this is thought of is it's not first there's one kind of risk and then another. It's the bigger risk is a progression in the growth of technologies from the first that to some extent anyway, by solving the immediate here and now risk, we get better and better. And we can put in place the institutions that we need, and you'll have heard our Prime Minister call for or suggest these kind of global institutions that would help us deliver on that, as well on that very big risk of Armageddon.
Okay. What's the not to get too provincial, but what's your interaction with the Biden administration like right now? Obviously the Prime Minister and Biden stood arm in arm on this topic. Biden has sort of indicated the UK, could exert a leadership role here, endorse the AI summit, I believe. But there's also, the United States has a very kind of non-enforceable Bill of Rights idea. There's a risk management framework that we're being developed at NIST, which the NIST people are very proud of, but I don't actually know whether the rest of the world is paying attention to it. They think they are. So I'm curious, what are your conversations with the U.S., with the White House, with the Biden folks?
Look, I think, as you say, now that this summit has been agreed, we see that as an incredibly positive step. I think the way we see it is there's really no reason for anybody to diverge on the outcomes of AI regulation, right? We obviously are going to have different approaches to doing it, whether you're the EU, whether you're also the United States or anybody else, because we all come from our own political cultures and political backgrounds. But at heart, the goal is the same. And I think we certainly, and of course I can't speak for any other administration, but we certainly take a view that collaboration and openness to collaboration is highly important to us, and that view is shared by all of our counterparts. And if I think of all the different international bodies that we're engaging with regularly now, the G7 through the Hiroshima Accord, OECD, European Council, and so on and so on. I won't bore everybody by listing them out. There's a lot of these international bodies going on, and everybody is coming enthusiastically to the table. I should say, including some of the big tech players as well, saying, come on, regulators. I think there's a real appetite on all sides to kind of get this right.
To connect that to the one thing we were talking about earlier, how strongly do you see yourselves as attempting to sort of work with and mesh with what the EU is trying to do, and how clearly is the UK strategy to try to really distinguish itself? Because, it sounds very kumbaya and everyone's working together on this, but in fact, to name the elephant in the room, post-Brexit, the UK has a very strong incentive to take its own course. It's a smaller market, but with real strengths and the ability to sort of work differently. And yet, this is the tech industry, is a giant global force that in some ways dwarfs individual governments, right? And governments, even ones that are trying to be resolutely independent, seem like they would benefit from working together.
Yeah, indeed. I think it is a very important question. I think there's no point in sort of regulatory competition in this space. I think we need to sort of arrive at the same landing zone. I think
is there active conversation happening with as the EU process works its way through?
Very regular, very active conversations going on with that.
Who is involved in them?
Generally at official level.
Yeah, who's
not at governmental level daily, but at official level, very, very regular and as open and practical and willing as you would expect. I think from a UK perspective, we're very keen to kind of offer thought leadership in this space to the extent we can. we're very open to suggestions and input from all sides. I think it's a shared problem with, as I said at the beginning, a very great prize for all of us.
I realize the EU people wouldn't predict this, but maybe you could predict what they are going to do, which is, and Stephen, you may have you've thought about this too. One of the big questions, I think we're winding up now. One of the big questions in evolving European legislation is whether or not there's going to be a blanket ban on facial recognition and biometrics in public places. That's emerged as a tension point as they finalize the law. That's actually kind of a big deal. I mean, in Britain, you must laugh because you have cameras everywhere, and so. But is Europe going to ban facial recognition, or do you think that they're going to hash out some compromise where they do it for crime and abduction and so many different things that it's basically not a ban?
Shall I sort of pick up the running on that one? So look, actually, just a couple of years ago, the ICO set out quite a clear guidance, actually, on how we expect facial recognition technology to be used in the UK, whether that's being used for the purposes of law enforcement or used in private capacity in public places, and set out what I think you can. I think we ourselves framed it as a high bar to the use of the technology in terms of thinking through questions about its necessity, its proportionality, etc. That's not equivalent to a ban. Right. That's saying, look, you've really got to ask some questions about, are there other ways to achieve your aims that would be, for example, more proportional, better in terms of their effectiveness? Or actually, is this the only tool that is left in the box for you?
Right. Okay. Well, I think we're about at our time. I feel like we've had a really enjoyable discussion. We're sorry that we've ended up sort of UK heavy. Nothing wrong with being UK heavy, but we've heard two meaningfully divergent ideas. Like there's an idea that there's fundamentally risk-based approach. Well, they're not meaningfully divergent. There's a risk-based approach the EU is definitely taking. It's regulating artificial intelligence, but not itself as a specific tool, but rather as like a series of things that it could do to people, or either by mistake or on purpose. The UK, I hear you saying a little bit of the same thing. You're much more interested in right now creating an environment of opportunity and feeling like you're not going to be the cop on the beat. But I do hear you're saying a little bit the same thing about thinking about a risk-based approach as sort of the underpinning philosophy of this. If I hear this right.
Risk-based for sure.
Yeah, and so I do see some sort of there's philosophical alignment in how we think about this new thing as it develops, and it's still kind of a wild unknown what the downstream consequences are going to be, and maybe how we even work the levers to make sure that we get that pivot that we want toward humanity later in the process. But we're very excited. Thank you so much for coming once again. Viscount Camrose, Jonathan, the AI Minister, and Stephen Almond from the ICO. Thank you so much. Our next and final interview is going to be Matt Kaminski speaking to Ambassador Catherine Tai, the United States Trade Representative. Thank you so much, everybody.